Early in their careers, two of the most intellectual of the Founding Fathers took extraordinary pains to create not just serviceable personal libraries, but collections of superlative quality. Writing in his diary on January 30th, 1768, John Adams, then a lawyer in Massachusetts, engaged in a fretful spasm of introspection. What was he accomplishing in life, the young professional asked himself, as he rushed from town to town, leading what he called a wandering life? Am I grasping at money or scheming for power? Am I planning the illustration of my family or the welfare of my country? These are great questions. In truth, I am tossed about so much from post to pillar that I have not leisure and tranquility enough to consider distinctly my own views, objects, and feelings. Adams recorded that he was at present devoting himself primarily to collecting a library, and was discovering that, in his words, a great deal of thought and care, as well as money, are necessary to assemble an ample and well-chosen assortment of books. Alas, he lamented, all this was only a means, an instrument. Whenever I shall have completed my library, my end will not be answered. Fame, fortune, power, say some, are the ends intended by a library. The service of God, country, clients, fellow men, say others. Which of these lie nearest my heart? Adams's mood of despair passed, and he went on to find abundant purpose in his life, as we all know. And when he died 58 years later, the library that he had conceived as an instrument of his still unfocused ambition had grown to more than 3,000 copies, or 3,000 volumes, one of the finest collections in the United States. While Adams in colonial Massachusetts was busily acquiring books, a lawyer down in Virginia was assiduously doing the same. Thomas Jefferson began to collect books while a law student in Williamsburg. Shortly before he turned 27, he had assembled a library whose worth he calculated at the not inconsiderable sum of 200 pounds sterling. In that year, 1770, he lost it all when his home went up in flames. Undaunted, he promptly set out to amass a second library, which attained the size of 1,256 volumes in just 3 years. By 1783, his collection had more than doubled, and all 2,640 volumes had been elaborately cataloged by Jefferson himself, according to a classification scheme derived from his hero, Sir Francis Bacon. Throughout his more than 83 years of life, the indefatigable Virginian never stopped buying books, loaning books to friends, and advising both relatives and acquaintances on worthy books to read. While serving as ambassador to France in the mid-1780s, he devoted many a spare afternoon to rummaging through the bookstores of Paris in search of treasures, especially those relating to America. "I cannot live without books," he told John Adams in 1815. By that year, Jefferson's library was probably the greatest personal collection in our country. The luminaries of the revolutionary generation were more than readers and book collectors, however. They were also, in a sense that I have already intimated, users of books. I do not mean to suggest that these extraordinary individuals could not enjoy reading for its own sake. Long after he had ceased to have any utilitarian reason for doing so, for instance, John Adams found delight in books. In his 82nd year, he read no fewer than 43 of them. Jefferson, in his retirement, shared this enthusiasm, at one point confessing to a canine appetite for reading. Interesting phrase. Years earlier, not long before he assumed the presidency, the Virginian wrote to a friend, To read Latin and Greek authors in their original is a sublime luxury. Nevertheless, what seems most noteworthy about the Founding Fathers' reading habits, at least during their active years on the public stage, was their tendency to regard books not as ornaments, but as tools. Once again, John Adams provides an apt example. In his surviving library, there are more than 100 works of 18th century European political philosophy containing extensive, often explosive marginal notations by Adams himself. From these sometimes mordant and often argumentative and occasionally lengthy handwritten comments right there on the margins, one can at times construct a virtual line-by-line dialogue between the European author, Rousseau, Voltaire, or whomever, and the feisty New Englander who penned his responses right on the printed page. In fact, some years ago, a scholar in Boston compiled all these marginalia into a fascinating book called John Adams and the Prophets of Progress. It is one of the most unusual evidences we have of how the Founding Fathers reacted to books and interacted with books. Another and very different illustration comes from that most worldly of the founders, Benjamin Franklin. In the year 1784, at the ripe old age of 78, Franklin wrote a letter to the son of the Puritan minister Cotton Mather. When I was a boy, I met with a book. Don't you like that? I met with a book entitled Essays to Do Good, which I think was written by your father. It had been so little regarded by its former possessor that several leaves of it were torn out. But the remainder gave me such a turn of thinking as to have an influence on my conduct through life. For I have always set a greater value on the character of a doer of good than on any other kind of reputation. And if I have been, as you seem to think, a useful citizen, the public owes the advantage of it to that book. Franklin was not the only American of his era whose entire life was profoundly affected by a book. George Washington was another. In his case, the book was a play, one of the most popular plays of the 18th century, entitled Cato, written by the Englishman Joseph Addison. In this play, the ancient Roman statesman Cato, wise, noble, heroic, falls on his sword at Utica, rather than surrender to the conquering armies of Julius Caesar. For American audiences of the time, Cato was a powerful morality play, an unforgettable discourse on republican virtue and the evils of Caesarian tyranny. Not a few colonials were inspired by Addison's eloquence and fervor. Patrick Henry's immortal words, "Give me liberty or give me death," bear a noticeable resemblance to certain of Addison's verses. Nathan Hale's dying regret that he had but one life to lose for his country recalled these lines from Act 4 of the play. "What pity is it that we can die but once to serve our country?" An avid theater goer, George Washington loved this play. He quoted from it in his correspondence. He ordered it to be performed in 1778 at Valley Forge as a morale booster for the troops. He even quoted a line from it when he decided in 1796 to retire from the presidency. There is little doubt that Roman Stoicism, mediated through a British stage play written in 1713, exerted an indelible influence on America's first president. Like Franklin, Washington discovered a persona in a book.